The Price of a Son. The world of Adrian Cole was a kingdom built on cold, hard cash and colder, harder ambition. He was a titan of industry, a man whose name was synonymous with power, and whose net worth was measured in 9 figures. Women were accessories, deals were conquests, and people who worked for him were tools, easily discarded once their purpose was served. His penthouse apartment in Manhattan was a monument to his ego, all glass, chrome, and a view that stretched to the horizon, a perfect reflection of his belief that the world was his for the taking. Among the polished marble and silent halls of his home was Eleanor Vance, a maid who moved through his world like a ghost. Quiet, diligent, and always in the background, she was a fixture of his opulent life, noticed only when a task needed doing. She was a presence, not a person, a function, not a woman with dreams and a heartbeat. One night, the sterile order of Adrian's life was fractured. The solitude of his penthouse after a drunken party, he in his ruthless sense of entitlement. It wasn't affection that drew him to Eleanor, but a careless whim, a moment of weakness he believed would be forgotten by morning. To him, she was a fleeting shadow, a release he would never speak of again. And by sunrise, he was back in his high-powered world, and she was back to her chores, the silent chasm between them wider than ever. For men like Adrian, consequences were things other people faced. But then, a phone call shattered that illusion. Eleanor, her voice a tremor of quiet determination, told him she was pregnant. Adrian's reaction was swift and brutally cold. He cornered her in a desolate hallway, the fluorescent light of the service entrance illuminating the disdain on his face. He slid a thick envelope of cash across the countertop. "Take this," he said, his voice as unfeeling as stone. "This isn't my child. Don't you dare try to trap me. I don't want you. I don't want this." He walked away without a backward glance. He had never been more certain of anything in his life. He was untouchable. The next 9 months were a testament to Eleanor's quiet strength. Alone, she bore the weight of whispers, the humiliation of gossip, and the grinding exhaustion of her new reality. The world had abandoned her, but her spirit, forged in solitude, held firm. When the time came, she lay trembling in a sterile hospital room, terrified but resolute, ready to bring her son into a world that had already rejected him. Adrian, driven by a gnawing curiosity he mistook for an intellectual exercise, showed up at the hospital a day later. He was there not to accept, but to confirm his denial. He stood in the doorway of her room, his expression a mask of glacial certainty. "See, I told you," he said, and for a split second, his eyes met the newborn's. It was a flicker, an instant that changed everything. The baby's eyes, a rare, piercing shade of steel grey, held a silent power. They were Adrian's eyes. They were his father's eyes, his grandfather's, staring back at him from the impossibly small face of a child he had just disowned. Adrian recoiled as if struck. He stumbled backward into the hallway, his face drained of color. He, the man who owned everything, was a prisoner of his own blood. He had used a human being, a vessel, to perpetuate a legacy more precious than all his wealth. And then he had cast it aside. Now that legacy looked at him with his own eyes, and he felt a weight he had never known before. He had never been defeated, but in that moment he was. When he finally found his way back into the room, Eleanor's gaze was a silent accusation. Her voice, though low, was a blade of ice. "You used me like I was nothing," she said, her words cutting deeper than any corporate takeover. "You left me to carry him alone. You don't deserve to hold him now." Her words were a truth bomb, an undeniable reality that pressed down on him, heavier than all the money he had ever stockpiled. He left, but the silence he had tried to buy now haunted him. His lavish penthouse felt like a cage. The images of Eleanor, clutching their son, if protecting him from the world and from him, flashed behind his eyelids. His arrogance, however, was a stubborn chain around his neck. He convinced himself he was right, that women like Eleanor were just after his money. His rich friends on Wall Street agreed, echoing his sentiment over expensive cigars and old whiskey. "These women see an opportunity," they'd say. "You did the right thing. Cole. But in the quiet hours of the night, the image of those eyes mocked him, a living, breathing argument that he had lost. Weeks later, the torment became unbearable. He found himself driving to the modest apartment complex in Queens, where Eleanor now lived. The marble halls of his high-rise felt hollow. This narrow stairwell smelled of dust and resilience. He knocked until she opened the door, her face a fortress of weary defiance. Inside, the baby slept in a small crib by the window. Adrian moved closer, his heart pounding in his chest. The baby stirred, opening his eyes and looking straight at him. The same steel grey eyes. His body trembled. For the first time, the man who thought he had the world in his hands felt small, vulnerable. He fell to his knees beside the crib, tears streaming down his face. His voice, a whisper of raw emotion, was a far cry from the confident tone that closed multi-million-dollar deals. "I was wrong," he choked out. "He's mine. I want him." Eleanor watched him, her arms crossed, her face devoid of pity. She had no tears left, and no forgiveness to spare. "You can't erase what you said," she told him, her voice unwavering. "You can't erase the months I carried him alone, the nights I begged for help you refused to give. You can't erase how you looked at me, like I was nothing." Adrian broke. He buried his face in the edge of the crib, sobbing quietly. The man who commanded boardrooms and destroyed competitors was now reduced to begging for a chance at redemption, not with money, not with power, but with a love he had never learned how to give. From that night on, Adrian Cole was no longer the same man. Something in him had shattered the belief that money could excuse cruelty. He began returning to Eleanor's apartment, not as a master of her life, but as a man stripped of his pride. He would sit 4 hours, watching as she expertly changed diapers or soothed the baby to sleep. He fumbled with bottles, his hands, so used to signing contracts, now trembling as he tried to rock his son. What struck Eleanor most was that he kept coming back. He didn't send an assistant or gifts. He came himself. Every night, he would return, a little more patient, a little less proud. He learned to cradle his son against his chest, until the baby's tiny breaths slowed into a rhythmic pulse. He hummed lullabies in a voice raw with guilt, songs he hadn't sung since his own childhood. When the baby's small hand wrapped around his finger, Adrian wept. In that fragile grasp, he felt a connection money could not buy. Forgiveness was still unsaid, but it was offered in the innocent gaze of a child who knew no rejection. Eleanor remained guarded. She never forgot his cold dismissal in the hospital, the words that had cut through her when she was at her most vulnerable. "This isn't mine." The wounds couldn't be erased with a few tender gestures, but she began to see a consistency where once there had been only cruelty. He wasn't there out of obligation or to save his reputation, but because he was fighting to become a father. His fortune seemed to shrink in his eyes. The contracts, the meetings, the polished image he had built for decades, it all felt hollow. He had lived for power, but that power had deserted him the moment he denied his own blood. Now, the small, gurgling sound of his son's laughter in a modest apartment meant more than the echo of his name, the grandest boardrooms. Years later, the boy would never know the bitterness of that first rejection. He wouldn't remember the hospital room, of the sting of his father's denial. What he would remember was a father who showed up, who tried, who carried his guilt and silence with him, but his love in his arms. And Adrian, letting go of the pride that had once defined him, understood a truth deeper than his millions. The greatest poverty is not living without money. It is living without love, without humility, without a family. He had been a pauper in his kingdom of wealth, but now, in a small apartment in Queens, he was the richest man in the world. He finally had his son,